Thank you for joining us for the first episode of the second season of HeLPiNG Questions. I'm Dr. Alicia Luque, HeLPiNG Questions host. In today's episode, we will have the opportunity to ask Professor Sharon Unsworth our sixth HeLPiNG question. Professor Sharon Unsworth is an associate professor in the departments of Modern Languages and Cultures and Language and Communication at Radboud University in the Netherlands. Sharon's research on child bilingualism is groundbreaking and absolutely fascinating, and focuses on understanding the ways in which multilingual children simultaneously learn multiple languages and what factors might be associated with successful language learning. Please take a seat and stay with us as we get to hear more from Sharon about the ways in which we can support child bilingualism both inside and outside of the family context. Welcome, Sharon, to the first episode of the second season of HeLPiNG Questions. We're so excited to have you as our guest and to be able to discover together fascinating scientific facts about bilingualism. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure.
It's our pleasure, really. And well, ever since we launched our first episode, many parents and caregivers have contacted us asking us for advice as to how to raise and support bilingual children. And that's why we thought we needed to have an episode focusing exactly on that and considering the groundbreaking contributions you have made to help us better understand what it means for children to be and become bilingual. We couldn't think of a better person to ask our sixth HeLPiNG question. So, should we jump right in?
Let's do it.
Okay, great. Then, Sharon, based on your experience, knowledge, and expertise, what are some specific ways in which we can support child bilingualism, both inside and outside of the home or the family context?
Yeah, so that's a really great question and one that I could fill hours and hours with in responding to it. But I think if we talk about inside and outside the family context, if we just leave school B for now, right, because I think that's a whole different kettle of fish. And I think the first, if we start at the start, like when children are little, or even when you're expecting a child and they're going to be growing up in a bilingual context, I think it's important to have a plan, or to at least think about what's going to happen. Talk about it with your partner, and not only your partner, preferably also with your wider family and friends. So talk about what it is that you want for your child, right? How bilingual would you like them to be, right? Do you want them to be able to like go back to your country of origin and go to university, right? Which is like they're going to have to be super literate and know loads of stuff and have a great vocabulary, be very comfortable in that language. Or you're just happy that they can understand what grandma says when she comes over, right? So I think it's important just to think a little bit about that, and also then to consider your expectations or your goals and what you would like, and then measure them up a bit against what the real situation is, right? Because sometimes we could really want our children to become super bilingual, but actually if you're the only speaker of that language, there's no wider community, you also speak like the language of the community around you, so no Norwegian where you are, you're with a Norwegian speaking partner, the kid goes to Norwegian language school, there are very few resources in your language, whatever, in apps or YouTube or whatever, then your child's going to have limited input. They can still become bilingual, but they maybe will become more likely to be a passive bilingual. I'm by no means trying to put off any parents in this situation, but so really great book actually for this is Eowyn Crisfield's book called Family Language Planning. I think it's called Family Language Planning, a guide, and that really helps you think about, consider all these issues. So that's my top recommendation when it comes to books. And I think also another thing is to be aware of what the options are, what your choices are when you do have choices, right? Not everybody has choices. You can't always say you can't choose who you fall in love with and what language they speak, right? So sometimes you just don't have choices about who's going to speak what language. But if you do have choices, to be aware of what the consequences are. And as a parent, like in many things, you make choices that fit best with you and your situation, and that goes for bilingualism just like it goes for what food you give your kids, whether you let them choose to go outside wearing a t-shirt when it's really cold, all those things, right? It's entirely up to you as a parent what you do. So I think it's our job actually as linguists and science communicators is to make sure that parents and teachers understand what the science tells us about what the consequences might be of certain choices that you make, but which choices you make are entirely up to parents. I think also it's good to be consistent, especially in the early years. And by consistent, I don't mean, oh, you should never mix your languages, right? We know the research on language mixing, there's not much of it actually, which is surprising given that it's one of the questions that parents often ask. But the research on that there's no suggestion that if parents mix their languages that the children will somehow be their development will be impaired, ruined, very different from those whose parents don't mix. At least there's no real concrete suggestion that's the case. Yeah, so what I mean by being consistent, I think, is about developing a kind of expectation that this is the language that we speak. So I live in the Netherlands. I'm British, native speaker of English. My partner is Dutch, very, very good speaker of English. He decided, with no pressure from me, everybody thinks otherwise, but with no pressure from me, to speak English to our children. So we have an English speaking household, and it's been, I think that's partly been the success that our kids are pretty bilingual. They're 11 and 9 now, and they still consistently speak, more or less consistently speak English at home. And I think part of that is because it's always just been, that's the way it is. The expectation, and that we have pretty much consistently spoken English. I mean, we change when, Opa and Oma, so my partner's parents are over and they don't speak English. We often switch to Dutch then. But I think it's just having this expectation, this culture of this is the language that we speak here. So I mean, that's what I mean a bit by being consistent. I think also it's really important that you make it fun, right? It shouldn't be. So I think very often, especially when we start talking about having a plan and goals, it almost becomes like a project. And it shouldn't, you should never make a project out of your children. Even if you're a linguist who studies bilingual language development, you should never make a project out of your children. So I think it's really important to make it fun, right? So it does cost a bit of an effort, especially if there aren't many resources for your language, for the heritage language that you speak, or minority language, or whatever you want to, home language, whatever you want to call it. But engaging with them, playing games, right? Finding, doing jigsaw puzzles together, and then really talking about what can you see, or doing a jigsaw puzzle where you cut up a picture of something that's related to your culture, and then, using that and talking about it. These aren't my ideas. These are from this project, the European project called the Peach Project, which has got a brilliant website with loads of inspiration for games. That's a really great place to go. Somebody who's involved in that project, Ute Limacher-Riebold, has got this with two colleagues, a YouTube channel where where they give you suggestions for games to play, right? So that's making the fun parts. That's a great place to go to get inspiration. And the making the fun bit is also that's also part of keeping it positive, right? So often, it can be really frustrating, and I have that too, when the kids say stuff in Dutch and I think, oh, you know how to say that in English, but then they don't. But it's very hard, right? It's a fine line to tread when between being encouraging and supporting, and like what I said, just being consistent and creating this expectation that this is the language that we speak in our family, and you're expected to do that too, and then being a nag and being like, oh, Mom, I don't want to speak. Yeah, I know it in English, but I just want to speak Dutch, right? So
That is a great point. And I have to say that I myself personally don't have children, but many, many people have come to me. I work with adult bilingualism, as you know. But like, especially after Ludo's episode, I had a couple of parents reach out to me exactly asking me, hey, Alicia, like in the context of Norway, for example, like I speak with my kids in Spanish at home, and they go to kindergarten, and I feel like they feel probably overwhelmed at the kindergarten in the
Hmm.
context, so much so that they feel frustrated, like they don't want to speak Spanish to me at home anymore, right? So this is, I think, as you said brilliantly and beautifully, like a very fine line between trying to also go a step, I think, beyond, to try to also like think about the emotional, right, context in which your kids also, it's a perfectly normal and accepted emotion to feel frustrated, right?
Yeah.
And yes, like how to manage that frustration and turn it into an opportunity to have fun and probably remind of the expectation. I have to say, then when this particular couple of people have asked me that, I was just like, oh wow, yeah, I mean, this is definitely something that I find particularly challenging if I was in that situation, how to manage
Yeah,
the frustration.
yeah, yeah, and it is, and I think so. You don't always have to do that reminding explicitly, right? You can just often just by, in the language teaching literature, it's called recasting, right? So you repeat what they said. I mean, this only works, of course, if you actually happen to speak the language of school or around. So Dutch in our case, Norwegian in your case. Just repeat what they said, but using the English word. That's generally what I do. Um, and often, not always, that can be enough of a trigger for them to then switch themselves, right? Because we know, and I'm sure you've spoken about it before already, as humans, we interact with, when we're interacting with each other, we like to, imitate, especially when we like somebody, we imitate in a certain way what they're doing, right? We mimic their behavior, and we can do that in that we repeat the structures that they use, but we can also do that in that we might switch to the language that they're using. And so you can use that to your benefit as a parent by, if your child, being aware of the, okay, my child is now speaking whatever the school language is. I want them to switch to the home language. I'm going to repeat what they said, hopefully, and carry on using that language, and hopefully it will have an effect on them. Because what we do know from research is the other way around, especially, for example, if you've got a toddler and they've got an older sibling, the older sibling goes to school, they often bring the school language home with them. Many parents will recognize this, I'm sure. And that can have an impact on how much it can be really good for the school language development for the younger child, but sometimes in certain contexts it might not be very good for the heritage language development, right? So, and I think that really does depend on the context. um but what it can also do, what research by Erica Hoff, for example, has shown, is that um it can lead to the parents also switching to use the school language more, right? Like I said, we kind of mimic what people, we go along with what other people are doing in the conversation. We might switch to that language, and then your younger child might not get as much input, right, in the heritage language. So yeah, I think going back to that keeping positive, um it's good to, compliment, acknowledge that it's pretty hard sometimes when you're tired, you can't be bothered, you're like, oh, your mum's nagging you that you have to speak to grandma on the phone, and you're gonna have to do it in the language that you really can't, that you feel less comfortable with, or that you haven't spoken for a while, or even though you might be understanding it the whole time. And so it's good if children make an acknowledge that, I know it's hard, I really like you to do it. And then, if they do, well done, I know you found it hard, but I'm really proud of you that you managed to do that even though you didn't want to, and you did a really great job. So have associations with bilingualism, children's bilingualism, being positive rather than, oh, I wish you would speak whatever language. I think that's, really important. And in terms of looking for, in the home context and outside the home context, look for all the resources that you can to boost the amount of input that children get, but also the different types of input that they get. Okay, so books is an obvious choice. So reading to children, especially when they're little, but you can carry on reading to and with children as they get older. Right, there's no reason why you can't do that. Audio books, if they're available. I think there's something on the Peach Project website with lots of links to audiobooks in different languages. And that's great. Podcasts, of course, I didn't say I have a podcast about bilingual children, Clet says.
Which is great, and we highly, highly recommend. And we'll put a link here. It's fantastic, and thank you for all your work with the
Oh,
podcast.
thanks. But that's not what your children want to listen to at all. Definitely not. But there are many podcasts for children, right? So yeah, that's also really great. Also great for in the car if you're going on journeys. But also in terms of people, you know, I think it's good to, for example, grandparents who maybe don't live nearby, to actively say, look, I really need your help. You know, if you want your grandkids to speak your language, you're going to have to be part of the team, right, to do that, because in many cases that really is the case. So, you know, and obviously you can't choose your family, so sometimes you have a good relationship with your family and sometimes you don't. But when you have a good relationship with your family, you know, use that. Try and foster relationships between cousins, so that your kids feel motivated. They want to speak that language because they know that's how they're going to be able to communicate with people that they know and love and like, right? And also you can think of community around you more closely, right? Other parents who are raising bilingual children. So I've interviewed quite a few parents over the past few years for the podcast, and one conversation that stuck with me was a parent who, she was a Czech speaker here in the Netherlands, and she really tried. She had a Dutch speaking partner. She really tried to speak Czech with her kids, but found it really hard and felt really alone. And in the end, you know, her Dutch is really good, and she just like, well, they started speaking Dutch to me, and then I just thought, oh, yeah, it's just too hard. And afterwards, you know, kids are teenagers now, and afterwards she's like, you know, I really regret not talking to people, not telling people. I find it really hard, like, because often we get told, you know, oh, kids, they're sponges and they'll become bilingual just like this. And, you know, yeah, language acquisition is an amazing thing. Kids do soak up language, and it's one of, like, it's, you know, it's just like an amazing thing that happens, right? Especially when it's 2 languages or 3 languages, sometimes even 4 languages. But that doesn't mean to say that as a parent there aren't things that you're going to find hard or things that require an effort. So I think finding a community around you, people that you can talk to, also people maybe you speak your language so that your children can interact with. I mean, often, you know, you have a club with Spanish speakers or Czech speakers, and the parents are speaking in Spanish and Czech, the kids are speaking in whatever the language is of school. But, you know, language is much more than, you know, being bilingual is much more than just speaking the language, right? It's also the cultural aspect. And so having a community where you celebrate the things that are important to you, the festivals, the occasions, in the way that you do, that's an important part of being bilingual or raising your children. To me, it's really important that my kids feel, you know, that they know what crumpets are, that they know that they have to say please and thank you a lot more. Well, they should say it all the time in my book, but you have to say a lot more when you're in the UK than you do in the Netherlands. You have to stand in a queue, you know, all these kinds of things, but also you know, that they know certain characters from film or books or whatever.
Yes, of these kind of pop culture references, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's something that you can get by having a little community of people around you. Another good tip actually is see if there is like a kids newspaper or something, like a week. So for English, there's the week. There's a UK and a US version, so we have that, and we have the Dutch version as well. You know, and I appreciate not all parents can maybe it doesn't exist in all languages, and maybe you don't have the funds to be able to pay for it, but you know, club together with other people. You know, I don't think kids really mind if the news is a few weeks old, if you're passing it around or whatever. And often these also contain those pop culture references for the country or community that you're from. So that's also, and also, you know, it's great getting something through the post, right?
Yeah.
Kids love getting things through the post. Or there too as well, you can ask grandma and granddad to send postcards, or right. So it's, you know, if your kids are learning to read in a language, it's really important that they have, I think, and that's the one thing that really key is to find them genuine opportunities to use that language. Right, so you're saying, you've been contacted by parents who maybe can't, whose children understand what they're saying in the heritage language, but respond in Norwegian or whatever the language of the community is. And that is the most, the question that I get asked the most, like, what do we do in those situations? And I think what seems to be key is not only they're having the rich and varied input, but also the need to use the language. Mm-hmm. Right? If they know that you speak Norwegian and you understand it, or Dutch in my case, there's a good chance that they're going to think, well, I don't really need to use it. Might not even be conscious, but they know, right? So looking for those opportunities, find those people who can't speak it, like find a babysitter, a student who's just arrived who can't speak whatever language it is, or we'll at least pretend that they can't, so that the kids have to switch, right? And and I think I also know stories of parents who have consistently had their children speak back to them in the school language. So our neighbor across the road had this. She's American, and her kids have always spoken Dutch to her. And then last year they went on holiday to America for the first time in a while, obviously COVID, for 3 weeks, and came back, the kids were speaking English. She was like, all the time it was there, and it was just they needed the chance to use it. That's a really inspiring story, actually. That's also on one of the episodes of the podcast this year. So genuine opportunities.
Absolutely. And really thank you so much for everything you've shared with us. So insightful, so important. I'm sure many parents are going to be like taking note. We're going to make sure to, once we post the video very soon, we'll have access to all the links that you shared with us. And great. Thank you so much for your generosity, your time, and for helping us understand better how to support child bilingualism inside and outside of the family context. And it was an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
We really hope you enjoyed our 6th helping question, and that Sharon's fascinating scientific insight and professional experience helped you to better understand some of the ways in which we can support child bilingualism, both inside and outside of the family context. Stay tuned for our next episode coming to you on October 1st. We will get to ask Professor Diane Lillo-Martin, Distinguished Professor of Linguistics at the University of Connecticut in the United States, our 7th helping question. Can we consider people who are able to communicate using both sign and spoken languages to be bilingual? We look forward to seeing you all back here on October 1st. Also, do not forget to subscribe and to share with us your thoughts, feedback, and comments on any of our social media channels. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you back here on October 1st. Bye!